This episode is called River of Blood. On a hot and sticky morning in August of 1976, 44-year-old MrBallen Lokela woke up drenched in sweat. It was his first morning back in his remote village of Yambuku in the country of Zaire, and he didn't feel right. MrBallen was the school headmaster in a poor community that lacked basic necessities like phones, running water, and electricity. He could almost never afford the luxury of a real vacation, but he had spent the past 2 weeks traveling Zaire's rainforests. He'd visited friends and family and spent some time hunting rainforest game like monkeys, antelope, and red river hogs. He'd had a great time, even though toward the end of the trip, he developed a persistent headache that developed into a fever. On the last morning, he woke up feeling shaky and nauseous, which made the long van ride back home absolutely awful. MrBallen had hoped that a good night's sleep in his own bed would help him feel better, but now, as he lay there staring up at the ceiling, he was feeling even worse. His stomach was churning and he felt a bit dizzy too. He could tell this fever was not about to go away on its own. He needed medication. The only medical care that was available was a local clinic that was staffed by Belgian nuns and a few villagers. There were no doctors, and the clinic was really just set up to provide prenatal care for pregnant women. But usually, the nuns did have enough medication to tend to the village's basic medical needs. So MrBallen dragged himself out of bed, careful not to disturb his sleeping wife. He fished a clean shirt out of his travel bag, and then made the long walk from his home down the dirt road all the way to the clinic. 20 minutes later, MrBallen felt weary from walking in the morning sun, but he could see the distinctive red metal roofs of the complex that housed the clinic just ahead. He felt grateful that these nuns from so far away had come to live in their village, especially today. He really needed their help. Once MrBallen had crossed the clinic's courtyard and stepped through the door, he felt a bit better. It was still cool inside, since the sun had not been up long enough to warm the building up yet. He looked down the row of beds, all kept impeccably tidy, and then he looked along one wall, and he saw a nurse was putting a few pill bottles into a row of beat-up supply cabinets. MrBallen knew this nurse. He was a local man who was named Sakado, who worked for the nuns. Sakado waved, and then asked MrBallen what brought him to the clinic that morning. MrBallen pointed at his head and said he'd been sick with a headache and fever for days. Sakado nodded sympathetically and asked MrBallen to have a seat in one of the little folding chairs by the door. One of the nuns would be over to talk to him shortly. As soon as MrBallen sat down, he closed his eyes and leaned his aching head back against the cool cement wall. He was lost in a daydream when he heard the click of footsteps on the clay tile floor, and then a soothing voice spoke his name. He opened his eyes to greet a short Belgian nun in a white linen dress. The nun pulled down the cotton face mask she was wearing and introduced herself as Sister Adela. She beckoned him over to one of the beds and told him he was welcome to lie down while she took his vitals, and so MrBallen happily obliged. After a quick exam, the nun told MrBallen that he probably had malaria, a disease carried by mosquitoes that runs rampant in much of Africa. It's usually characterized by fever and flu-like symptoms, just like MrBallen had. And so Sister Adela moved over to the worn cabinets along the wall and pulled out a syringe that was full of clear liquid. She explained that the liquid was a medication called quinine, which treated malaria. Sister Adela gently stuck the needle into MrBallen's left arm and then pushed the medicine inside of him, and then she set the syringe aside and put a bit of cotton over the drop of blood from the needle. She told MrBallen to go home and take a nap, and he'd be back to normal in a couple of days. MrBallen thanked her, then slowly stood up and made his way out of the clinic. 8 days later, MrBallen's wife, Mbuzu, spooned some broth into a bowl and set it beside the bed she shared with her husband. She tied her long braids with a strip of leather and slipped into her shoes by the door. Her shoes looked miniature next to MrBallen's shoes. He towered over her when they stood side by side. But now, as he was curled up in bed, she thought he looked so small. MrBallen was still sick despite having gone to the clinic. In fact, after visiting the clinic, he came back and developed diarrhea and was vomiting so much that Mbuzu thought that he must be dangerously dehydrated. Her husband was so weak he couldn't even get out of bed. Mbuzu knew she needed to get her husband more help, so she told MrBallen she'd be right back, and she started walking to the clinic herself. When Mbuzu stepped into the clinic, she saw Sister Adela tending to a patient. Mbuzu waved her down and told her that her husband's symptoms had only gotten worse. She begged Sister Adela to please come home with her and see MrBallen. Sister Adela seemed alarmed that MrBallen was still sick, and so she agreed to go. Sister Adela told her mother superior that she'd be back in an hour. When the two women reached MrBallen's bedside, Mbuzu gasped. Her husband wasn't moving, and there was blood oozing from his eyes and ears. Mbuzu screamed and rushed to her husband. MrBallen opened his mouth like he was going to speak. Mbuzu leaned closer to hear whatever he was going to say, but then jumped back as a small river of blood gushed out of his mouth, trailing down his chin and staining their bedsheets. Horrified, Mbuzu turned to Sister Adela, who stared in disbelief. Then Mbuzu heard MrBallen begin to throw up, and so she grabbed a bucket just as he vomited up bile and blood. Mbuzu kept telling her husband that he'd be okay, but Sister Adela quietly shook her head. Mbuzu could tell by the nun's shell-shocked expression that she clearly had no idea what to do. Sister Adela just said she'd give him another injection of quinine, even though the last shot had done no good at all. After giving him the quinine injection, Sister Adela stayed a bit longer, helping Mbuzu clean up the blood dripping from her husband's eyes and ears. Once he was all cleaned up, Sister Adela told the couple that she promised to check in the next morning. But as she left, Mbuzu began to worry that tomorrow might be too late. A few days later, on September 7th, 1976, Mbuzu held her husband's hand as he took sharp, labored breaths. Sister Adela's quinine injections had not done anything. MrBallen was still unbelievably sick, his eyes had not stopped bleeding, and his saliva was red with blood. Mbuzu could hear blood gurgle in her husband's throat as he struggled to get air. She squeezed his hand helplessly until she heard her husband stop breathing. Suddenly, Mbuzu felt a terrible emptiness. Her husband was dead. She wrapped their bedsheet around MrBallen, letting her tears fall onto his motionless body. A few hours later, Mbuzu stooped over MrBallen's body alongside the women of MrBallen's family and some of Mbuzu's closest friends. Their front yard was full of neighbors and loved ones who came to sit with Mbuzu as she grieved. Despite her grief, Mbuzu felt touched by how many people mobilized to support her. Mbuzu and the other women washed MrBallen's body and wrapped him in a clean burial shroud. This was the funeral tradition in their village. Tomorrow, the men in the village would move MrBallen to the graveyard to be buried. A few days later, on the morning after MrBallen's funeral, Mbuzu awoke feeling totally exhausted. She'd barely eaten since her husband died, and she was completely worn out from crying. The moment she sat up, her head began to throb. She rubbed her temples trying to ease the pain, and then, without warning, she felt vomit surge in her throat. She barely had time to run outside before she threw up. Mbuzu knew this had to be more than just exhaustion. She cleaned herself up and then headed for the clinic right away. MrBallen's nurse friend, Sukato, had just finished sweeping the floor when Mbuzu appeared at the doorstep that morning. She looked awful. Even though the morning was still fairly cool, Sukato could see that Mbuzu was sweating profusely. Sukato felt a shiver run up his spine as he remembered the day that MrBallen had stumbled through the clinic doorway. He'd looked just as sick as Mbuzu looked now. He told Mbuzu to sit down, and then he ran out back to grab the nuns. Sukato came back inside with Sister Adela, and together they led Mbuzu to a bed. Sukato gave Mbuzu an encouraging smile, even though he feared she'd caught the same disease as MrBallen, which obviously killed MrBallen. And when his eyes met Mbuzu's, he could tell she was fearing the same thing. A few days later, in mid-September, Sukato was at work, busy refilling syringes with quinine, the malaria medicine. Behind him, Mbuzu's mother, sister, and daughter were all lying in clinic beds alongside Mbuzu. All of them were suffering from the same high fever and persistent headache. Mbuzu's mother had started hallucinating, especially at night. Sometimes when she was sleepy and her fever was spiking, she'd say that her dead son-in-law was standing in the clinic. Other times, she would see shadows that were not there. Sukato felt certain that these women did not have malaria. For one thing, malaria is not contagious, so it made no sense that 4 women from the same family had gotten sick one after another. Then there was the way that Sister Adela had described MrBallen bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth before dying. Sakato had never seen malaria cause something like that. To Sakato, it seemed like this bleeding sickness was something new and that it was somehow spreading among families. Mbuzu and her relatives had not started bleeding yet, but if their illness progressed anything like MrBallen's had, it wouldn't be long until they did. The thought of an entire room full of patients all bleeding from their eyes horrified Sakato, and if their disease really was contagious, then he could be lying in bed among them by tomorrow bleeding out of his eyes. But then he looked across the room to a perfectly healthy pregnant woman who was resting in bed with an IV in her arm. She had come in for a routine checkup and prenatal vitamins. For this woman and everyone else in Yambuku, the little clinic was the only healthcare they had. It was literally the difference between life and death for countless villagers. Sakato knew that whatever the risk, he had to keep coming back to work. People were counting on him. Full of renewed purpose, Sakato finished filling the syringes of quinine and went to help his patients. A week later, just before sunrise, Sakato stood outside the clinic door with a growing sense of dread. More and more villagers were getting sick, all with the same horrible symptoms. 21 people had come to the clinic with this disease so far, and every single one of them had lingered in bed, unable to eat or drink, growing so weak that they could barely lift their heads, until finally, around the 10-day mark after getting sick, blood would start leaking from their ears and eyes. Some patients had red-stained teeth from all the blood pooling in their mouths. After that, it was only a matter of days before they died from blood loss. Almost all of the people who'd gotten sick had died. Mbuzu had lived, but she lost her entire family. At this point, only 4 patients remained alive in the clinic. And the outbreak was far from over. 2 days ago, one of the pregnant women who came for prenatal vitamins began bleeding. Sakato had tended to her himself, knowing that if the mother died, her baby would too. The stress was really weighing on him. Even from the clinic doorstep, he could already smell the sweat and sickness of the patients inside. But as scared as Sakato was about getting sick himself, he was not going to stop helping. He pulled his protective mask from his pocket and wrapped it around his face. Then he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As quietly as possible, Sakato moved down the row of beds, and by the far wall, the pregnant woman was lying on her side beneath the blanket. Sakato held his breath as he approached her, hoping she was still alive. But as he rounded her bed and crouched down, he could tell that she was not breathing. Sakato wanted to get a wet rag to clean her up a bit, but he knew that duty belonged to her family. So he just pulled the bedsheet up over her head and said a little prayer for everyone who remained in Yambuku. One morning a few days later, so in late September, Sakato sat by Sister Adela's bedside. The brave nun who had treated so many patients with the bleeding sickness now had the disease herself. And sadly, she was far from alone. 17 nuns lived at the mission, and 11 of them had fallen ill with this sickness. Sakato and Sister Adela had cared for them together, in addition to the patients still lying in the clinic across the courtyard. One by one, each of the 11 nuns had died except for Adela, who was barely clinging to life. The Mother Superior had been forced to close the clinic altogether, leaving this ravaged village with no one left to care for the sick and dying. Sakato's sick neighbors had started leaving Yambuku, searching for help in nearby villages. Nobody had returned alive. But it was no better in Yambuku. Sakato did the math and realized that so far, 90% of the people treated at their clinic for this bleeding sickness had died. Sakato pressed an aspirin into Sister Adela's shaky hand and then handed her a cup of water. The clinic had treated so many patients over the last month that they were down to their last aspirin, and this was it. Sister Adela thanked him with a hoarse voice, and he told her to please get some rest. Sakato left her room and walked down the long cement hallway that ran through the nuns' living quarters. For years, this had always been a very busy and bustling corridor, but now it was a ghost town. Sakato walked past empty room after empty room where the nuns used to live before the bleeding sickness had killed them. As Sakato neared the kitchen, he heard the crackle of static filtering in from the supply closet where the nuns kept their two-way radio. He peeked inside and found the Mother Superior turning dials as she tried to reach the outside world. She looked up at Sakado, and he was taken aback by the weariness in her face. She told him that all morning she'd been calling for help. She'd sent out radio signal after radio signal, hoping someone might hear and get word to the Red Cross or the Zairian government that they desperately needed help, but so far nobody had responded. Sakato felt a wave of dread wash over him as he listened to the Mother Superior's grim news. Over the past 6 weeks, they'd received no news from the outside world and no additional medical supplies. And now Sakato wondered how far the disease had really spread. Had it gone all the way across Africa? Was it all over the world? Was there anybody still left out there? Sakato needed fresh air. He stumbled out of the kitchen into the backyard behind the mission complex. Nearer to the tree line, there was a row of 11 white crosses marking the dead nuns' graves. Sakato had helped dig those graves. He imagined Sister Adela lying there on the edge of the jungle beneath her white cross, and now he wondered who would dig his grave when he eventually caught this sickness and died too. And then, almost like clockwork, a wave of nausea overtook him. Sakato hunched over and vomited on the ground, and when he looked down, his vomit was full of bile and blood. He had finally caught the bleeding sickness. About a week later, on the last day of September, Sakato was laying in bed staring at the ceiling. Because the clinic was shut down, he had just quarantined himself at home. Sakato had not left his bed for days, and he felt incredibly weak, but so far, he had not begun bleeding from the eyes or ears. He was determined to stay alive through sheer willpower. Just then, the ground beneath him began to shake, making the glass on his bedside table rattle. Sakato hoisted himself up onto his forearms to look out the window. He could see military vehicles making their way down the long dirt road that led into Yambuku. As Sakato watched in astonishment, the vehicles fanned out and surrounded his corner of the village. The soldier then spoke into the bullhorn and announced that Yambuku was now under quarantine. Nobody was leaving or coming back. Sakato was too weak, so he laid back down on his bed and just listened to the sound of the booming voice that was filling the air. The soldier continued and said that people in 50 surrounding villages were now also experiencing the bleeding sickness. Even people in the capital city of Kinshasa, 700 miles away, were showing symptoms. But the soldier said that the whole outbreak began right here in Yambuku. Sakato closed his eyes as the horror of their situation sank in. The disease was clearly spreading fast, and it was also clear that the government had no idea how to stop it. The people of Zaire needed help from the outside, but he couldn't imagine anyone would be brave enough to come to Zaire to fight this lethal sickness. A week later, a 27-year-old Belgian scientist named Peter Pio felt a rush of anticipation as he stepped off a plane onto an airstrip located 75 miles from Yambuku. It was a little more than a month after the first victim of the bleeding disease, Mabalo Lokela, had died. Peter was part of an international team of scientists and doctors sent to try to stop the disease before it spread beyond Zaire. Peter looked around the airstrip, taking in the lush green rainforest that hummed with plant and animal life. To him, it was the most beautiful landscape he'd ever seen. It was totally unlike anything in his native Belgium. Peter turned to help his teammates, who were all collecting their luggage from the belly of their little plane. Peter had to admit that he was not nearly as qualified for this assignment to go stop this disease as his teammates were. Peter had only recently graduated from medical school. However, he'd crammed in as much research as possible before he left Belgium. He learned about using protective equipment, taking samples in the field, and how to take and test blood samples. A few days earlier, the American Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, had confirmed that the bleeding disease plaguing Zaire was caused by a virus no one had ever seen before. Nobody knew where this virus came from or how to treat it, but they did know where they needed to start the investigation. Nearly 1/4 of the 300 or so cases across the entire country were reported in Yambuku. So Peter and his more experienced teammates knew that their journey would start right there. Peter was last to collect his bags from inside the plane. He told the pilot they were good to go, and the pilot shouted adieu as the plane took off. It occurred to Peter right away that in this part of Africa, people didn't really say adieu, they would say au revoir to say goodbye, which was French for see you again. But the pilot had just said adieu, which simply meant goodbye, as though he did not expect to see Peter or his colleagues ever again. Peter swallowed hard. There was no going back now. So he hoisted his bag up onto his shoulder and then followed the rest of his team off the airstrip toward a line of waiting Land Rovers. 4 hours later, from the back seat of a Land Rover, Peter saw a group of small wooden houses with thatched roofs in the distance. He knew that it had to be Yambuku. As they reached the center of the village, the Land Rover stopped. It took a moment for Peter to see why the drivers had pulled over. The road into the clinic compound was blocked. Hospital gauze was draped across the entrance to warn people to stay away. On a tree nearby, a sign had been nailed up. It read, quote, "Please stop. Anyone who crosses here may die," end quote. Peter could feel the mood in the Land Rover shift, as though the gravity of this situation was now truly sinking in. But nobody said a word, so Peter decided to take charge. He jumped out of the Land Rover, stepped over the gauze barricade, and began walking toward the clinic. As he approached, 3 nuns came rushing out, yelling at him to stop. But Peter kind of held up a hand, and he told the first nun that came up to him that they were doctors, and they were here to help figure out what was causing the bleeding sickness. Peter was touched by the look of utter relief on the nun's face. She said her name was Sister Marcella. She told Peter that for the past 2 weeks, the clinic had just been closed, and the remaining living nuns were simply praying for an end to this horror. She said that she and the others would do whatever she could to assist them, and motioned for Peter and the others to follow her inside the clinic. Peter carried his bag through the empty clinic and out into the courtyard. As the rest of the team got busy setting up a work camp, Peter asked Sister Marcella if they had any records of the patients who'd gotten sick from this disease and died. She nodded and promised to give him all her notes on the 70 victims from Yambuku, 63 of whom were now dead. Peter could hardly contain his shock. He'd known the disease was bad, but hearing the death toll out loud was staggering. 2 hours later, as the nuns cooked dinner, Peter and his team huddled around a table in the courtyard. Peter listened as the lead doctor explained their mission. The next morning, they would head out into the countryside looking for victims. They needed to talk to sick people and their families about when and where they got the disease, and then collect their blood for analysis. Peter was hoping that after a few days of interviews and testing samples, they could get an idea of how this disease was spreading. He felt energized again as he got up from the table and helped the nuns carry dinner out to his team. The next morning, Peter and 3 teammates drove west along a red dirt road on their way to visit nearby villages. Peter was struck again by how lush and green everything was. He loved listening to the sounds of insects and birds humming in the growing heat. It was easy to forget why he was there. But a reminder came soon enough when their Land Rover encountered a big pile of logs blocking the road about an hour west of Yambuku. The nuns had actually warned them about this. Most of these surrounding villages had blocked off their roads to keep out the people who had this bleeding sickness. The villagers had no supplies left to give out, and they obviously did not want to catch the sickness themselves. Peter wanted to respect their wishes, but it was vital for them to see what was going on in these other villages. So Peter and the rest of his team dragged the logs to the side of the road, then jumped back into the car and continued their journey. As the Land Rover made its way into the center of this village, people came out to see what was going on. Peter had expected the villagers to avoid them out of fear, so he was surprised when a few of the villagers gathered right around their car, looking very curious. The driver parked the car, and everybody piled out while the team leader went to speak with the village elders. Peter took a little piece of candy out of his pocket and handed it to one of the little boys who'd come to investigate. He noticed that none of the kids playing around the village seemed sick. He wondered if maybe the roadblock had worked. Perhaps it stopped the disease from reaching this village. Maybe there would be no blood samples to collect here, or survivors to talk to. That would be good news for the village, but a waste of a trip for Peter and his team. But then the team leader waved Peter over. He said one of the villagers had something to show them. So Peter grabbed his backpack from the Land Rover, and they followed this villager toward a nearby mud and clay home with a banana leaf roof. At the doorway, they all put on protective equipment, which included motorcycle goggles, gloves, paper face masks, and long sanitary gowns. Then they followed the villager into the modest home. It was cooler inside, but Peter's protective equipment still felt sweltering in the midday heat. Toward the back, Peter saw a husband and wife laying on a raffia mat on the floor. As Peter neared them, he could see they were so weak they could barely move. Dried blood coated their ears and their cheeks from where it had streamed out of their eyes. To Peter, it was like something out of a zombie film, and for a moment, he just froze. But then he remembered where he was and what he had to do. Peter took a syringe out of his backpack and knelt down next to the woman. He gently stuck the needle into her arm and filled a vial with her blood. The team leader knelt down on the other side of the raffia mat to take a sample from the man. Peter stood up and walked over to his backpack and pulled a little pouch from inside. He wrapped the vials of blood in plastic and stuck them into a baggie before putting the bag and the syringe into his backpack. And right as he did that, Peter turned around because his team leader gasped. It took Peter a moment to realize what had happened. The sick man on the floor had just died. Peter just stood there for a moment, totally frozen in surprise. Then he looked over at the dead man's wife, who looked like she didn't have long to live either. To Peter, it felt callous to leave her, and yet there was nothing they could do. They had no idea how to treat this new disease. In fact, the only way they could help was just to keep on moving. The villager who had led them into this hut ushered Peter and his team leader out of the home. As he walked them back to their car, the villager explained that soon that entire home would be full of women washing the man's body and preparing it for burial. It would be disrespectful for Peter and his teammate to be there anyway. So Peter, feeling relieved, thanked the man as he hopped into the Land Rover, and then they drove off to the next village. On the evening of the third day, Peter and his crew sat around their table in the clinic courtyard and compared notes. One thing they'd been noticing was that in many villages, more women seemed to get sick than men. And in Yambuku, a lot of pregnant women seemed to contract the sickness. But that wasn't enough information to actually draw any conclusions just yet. Strangely, the researchers had found that the village with the fewest bleeding sickness cases actually had no medical care at all. The village had only a traditional healer who handed out herbs and did healing rituals, but had almost no knowledge of modern medicine. And yet, his village was the only one they visited where nobody had died. The next day, Peter and his team leader went to that village where nobody had died yet to investigate further. When they arrived, the villagers brought them to their healer. As the team leader interviewed the healer, it occurred to Peter that the healer's home smelled strongly of bleach. He only noticed it because since landing in Zaire, he'd mostly smelled firewood, generator oil, and the jungle. So this chemical smell really stood out. Peter asked the healer why he was using so much bleach, and the healer just raised an eyebrow as though Peter had just asked him a totally ridiculous question. The healer pointed at a bunch of gadgets lying on top of a small table. Most were made of metal, and they looked like medical equipment, while others appeared to be homemade. The healer told Peter that those were his instruments, and he would use bleach and chlorine to sanitize them between clients. Once he said it, Peter almost felt dumb because the answer was so obvious. In the West, doctors used disinfectants to sterilize medical instruments, but in a place like this that was more remote, bleach was a decent substitute. Peter made a note of this in his journal. That evening, when they arrived back at the clinic in Yambuku, Peter followed Sister Marcella through the clinic, watching as she tidied up the space. He knew that she had seen this disease much more than they had, and so maybe she knew something that he and his team had not thought to ask about. Peter told her about the village with the local healer where nobody had died from the bleeding sickness. Sister Marcella said she actually was not surprised at all. She said the number of cases in Yambuku did not really start to rise quickly until the first patient, the school headmaster, had died. Peter stopped walking. The comment kind of struck him as odd. He asked Sister Marcella to explain what she meant. She turned and told Peter that, so far, the cases they'd seen had come in bursts. Every time there was a funeral, like clockwork, the next several cases of the bleeding sickness they would see would be people who had attended that funeral. It was like one big chain reaction. Peter thanked Marcella for the tour, and as he headed outside, his mind was racing. He and his teammates knew that this disease spread most easily to people closest to the sick, but they had not given much thought to the funerals themselves. Could it be that funerals were a breeding ground for this sickness? Marcella had said that it was usually close friends and family of the dead who got sick next, not all the other kind of random mourners who came to the funerals. So it wasn't just that funerals brought large groups of people close together. There had to be something about Zairian funerals that encouraged the spread amongst close family. Peter went to share this information with his team, determined to figure out what the cause might be. A few hours later, Peter sat around the courtyard table with his team, studying all the information they had collected from villages throughout the region. In every village they'd visited, the bleeding sickness had appeared in bursts, mostly affecting close friends and family of the deceased. And they noticed far more women were contracting the disease than men. Then there was another piece of information. In Yambuku, many pregnant women who visited the clinic later got sick. These pregnant women were just about the only ones to get the disease who had not recently been at a funeral for a close family member. Now, Peter and his team knew two things for certain. Something about these funerals was making people sick, and there was something unique about Yambuku that was giving the disease to pregnant women. Peter and his teammates talked into the night, but they just couldn't figure out what the connection was. It was like the explanation was staring them right in the face, but they just could not connect the dots. Peter rubbed his eyes, fighting off sleep. He did not want to give up and go to bed yet. So he stood and offered to make some coffee, and everyone agreed. Nobody was ready to call it a night. A few minutes later, Peter rummaged through the small kitchen in the nuns' living quarters, looking for the coffee. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the clinic's nurse, Sakato, carrying a tray of food. Peter had met Sakato several times and really liked him. Peter also knew that Sakato was one of the very lucky 10% of people to survive the bleeding sickness. So, to Peter, Sakato was like a walking miracle. Sakato also seemed to know just about everything, and he was always so eager to help. Peter asked Sakato if he wouldn't mind helping him find the coffee. Sakato smiled knowingly and then reached into one of the tall cabinets and pulled out a glass jar. That's when Peter had a thought. He asked Sakato to walk him through the procedure for when pregnant women came to the clinic for prenatal care. Sakato could do it in his sleep. He'd seen the nurses do it 1,000 times. He motioned for Peter to follow him into the clinic. There, Peter watched as Sakato walked to the counter in the back of the clinic and opened up one of the drawers. He withdrew 5 syringes and then told Peter that these were the 5 needles that they used to treat their patients: vitamin shots for expecting mothers and quinine shots for malaria patients. Sakato said they cleaned these needles every evening to keep them in good working order. As Sakato put the needles back in their drawer, Peter realized what Sakato had just said, that they were only cleaning the needles once a day. He blinked, trying not to seem too alarmed. He clarified with Sakato that the clinic used the same needles between pregnant women and bleeding sickness patients, and Sakato said yes, especially in the beginning when the nuns thought everybody just had malaria. Peter was dumbfounded. That meant healthy pregnant women who had come to the clinic to get a vitamin shot were likely being injected with tiny droplets of blood from people who had the bleeding sickness. No wonder so many pregnant women and their babies were dying in Yambuku. They were being directly injected with the disease by their nurses. The thought of it made Peter sick. Peter remembered the healer whose home smelled like bleach. He had been actually sterilizing his instruments between patients, and so that was why the bleeding sickness had not spread in his village. Now the wheels in Peter's brain were really turning. He thought back to the man who died right as they took his blood sample during the first week in Zaire. The villager who'd taken them there had said the women in the dead man's family had to wash his body for burial right away. And right then, Peter's eyes went wide as he had this sudden realization. He thanked Staccato and hurried right back out to the courtyard where his teammates were working, because he had a vital piece of information he needed to share with them. Peter and his team soon realized that the bleeding sickness was spread through contact with bodily fluids. In Zaire, part of the funeral custom was for the women in the family to wash the body of the deceased immediately after death. The virus was still very much alive on the dead body and spread when loved ones came into contact with bodily fluids such as blood. Meanwhile, the pregnant women in Yambuku were getting this disease from contaminated blood on the syringes used for their vitamin shots. As Peter and his team researched the disease further, they soon discovered that this lethal virus was originally confined to animals like chimpanzees and fruit bats. Mabalo Lokela, the school headmaster in Yambuku, and Patient Zero likely ate infected game on his hunting trip and became the first human victim. His wife Mbuzu and her family then caught the virus while preparing his body for burial. By the time Peter and his team learned how the bleeding sickness spread, nearly 300 people across Zaire and neighboring southern Sudan had died. But the spread was stopped thanks to the villagers' self-imposed quarantine and medical information being shared widely about the danger of sharing needles and touching bodily fluids. Peter and his teammates were tapped with naming this disease, and they decided to call it the Ebola virus after a river in the area. They thought about naming it Yambuku, but they didn't want to stigmatize the village. Since 1976, there have been more than 38 outbreaks of Ebola and over 15,000 deaths. Now, there is a vaccine for a particular strain of the Ebola virus, but as of today, there is still no cure. Is a small Japanese island about 500 miles south of the Japanese mainland. During World War II, the Japanese put a base on this island, and they put 2 radio towers at the top of the 2 mountains on the island. These radio towers became integral to the Japanese communication and surveillance operations in the Pacific during the war. And so at that time, the island was heavily fortified with up to 25,000 troops and huge anti-aircraft guns. Because of the island's obvious strategic value to Japan, the Americans wanted to take it from them. But American military strategists advised against that, saying that any amphibious landing of this island would result in massive casualties for Americans, and the Japanese would likely just repel the attack anyways. And so the Americans decided to go with the next best thing, which was to attempt to bomb the 2 towers and cut out their communications. So in June of 1944, American aircraft carriers, which are those huge ships that planes can take off of and land on, they headed for the island of Chichijima. And once the island was completely surrounded, the Americans began launching their pilots to try to take out these towers. But the Japanese fought back in a major way, and despite taking heavy casualties on their side, they repelled every American air raid and kept them from bombing their towers. After several months of these failed missions over Chichijima, the American military leaders were incredibly frustrated. They knew this was going to be a difficult mission, but they didn't expect it to be this difficult. However, this island was so strategically important that the Americans knew they had to just keep on sending pilots in until they took out these towers. And so in September of that year, the Americans were back to planning another raid over Chichijima Island, and one of the pilots selected to go on this particular raid was a 20-year-old named George, who actually was the youngest pilot in the United States Navy at the time. But despite his age, he'd actually flown in several combat missions already and had actually been shot down already and had to eject into the ocean and was subsequently rescued. On the morning of this raid, George, along with his 2-man crew, which was his radio operator named Dell and his door gunner named Ted, they boarded the plane, and then at 7:15 a.m., George and his crew took off, along with dozens of other American aircraft that were part of this operation. George immediately climbed above 8,000 feet because that would put
put them outside of anti-aircraft gun range. And so the way this mission would work is all these pilots would fly over the island, and then in order to drop their bombs, they would have to dive down below 8,000 feet and then manually drop their bombs and then try to get back up above 8,000 feet and out away from the island. And so George had run missions like this before, and so he was one of the first to actually make that dive down to the island. And as soon as he went below 8,000 feet, the island just erupted with anti-aircraft gun fire. So all these rounds are coming up, flak is popping all over the place, and George almost immediately notices the side of his plane gets hit. But the plane's stable enough that he decides he's just going to keep on diving down and complete the mission. And he's yelling back to Ted and to Del to hold on, and they get all the way down to 3,000 feet when George releases two 500-pound bombs that are direct hits on the radio tower he was assigned to bomb. But at this point, George's plane is now engulfed in flames. It can barely fly, and so George is again yelling at Ted and Del to hold on. He's pulling back on the lever, and he begins to turn himself away from the tower out towards the water, and he manages to fly away from the island, but he can feel the plane starting to go down. Now, George had previously been shot down before, and what he learned from that is how important it was to fly as far away from the enemy as you possibly can before you bail out of your plane. Because if you bail too early and you land in the water right near where the enemy is, you'll just get captured. And so George was holding on to that lever and keeping his plane up as long as he possibly could. And so he's flying and getting lower and lower and lower and closer to the water, and Ted and Del are yelling at him that they gotta jump out. Meanwhile, outside, the other planes that had sustained damage, the other American planes, their crews are already bailing out. But George is saying, no, hold on. And he keeps going farther and farther until he's so close to the water that it's practically too late. And then he gives the order to jump out of the plane. George abandons his controls. He leaps out the door and he hits his head on the back of the plane as he leaps out. But his chute would open up right before he hit the water, and it would save his life. As soon as George hits the water and he comes up for air, he's under his parachute. And so he's trying to get his parachute away to get a breath of air. He disconnects his parachute from his shoulders. He clears the parachute and he's looking around, and he sees his plane that is now being flown by no one go crashing directly into the water. And so immediately he's looking around for Ted and Del's parachute to make sure they're okay, but he doesn't see any parachutes anywhere. However, George notices a life raft from his plane had miraculously just landed like 10 feet away from him. So he swims over to the life raft, he climbs inside, and once he's in there, all he's thinking about is Ted and Del. So he's yelling for Ted, he's yelling for Del, but he's not getting a response. And so George turns around in the raft. So now he's facing towards the island, and to his horror, way off on the horizon, right near the edge of this island, are Japanese patrol boats that are speeding in his direction. He knows they're coming to get him and the other people that had jumped out of these planes. And so George turns back around, he leaps onto his chest on the front of this raft, and he starts using his hands to swim as fast as he can away from this island. The whole time he's screaming out for Ted and Del in hopes he's going to find them. Little did he know that both of them had not survived the crash. One had not even jumped out of the plane and had died on impact, and the other had jumped out, but their parachute had not inflated. And so George is swimming as fast as he possibly can, and he's yelling out for Del and for Ted, and he's looking, but he doesn't hear them, he doesn't see them, and he knows that not only is he not going to find his friends, but there's just no way he's going to outswim these boats. And so at some point, he just turns around and sits in the raft, and he's looking towards these patrol boats, and he knows that at some point they're going to come up here and they're going to capture him. And all he can think about is how guilty he feels about Ted and Del. And he starts second guessing his decision to keep that plane flying as long as he did and make them bail out so late. And he's thinking, I probably got them killed. And then he thought about his wife, and he wondered if he'd ever see her again. And then he turned towards these Japanese boats that were much closer now, but still fairly far away. And he began mentally preparing himself for captivity. But before he could be captured, American aircraft come storming in overhead, and they go flying past him towards the island, and they start dropping bombs and strafing these Japanese boats that were coming out to get George. And so George is thinking, oh my goodness, what luck. He turns around, he gets back on his chest, and he starts swimming as fast as he can, trying to get away, knowing that these boats are totally preoccupied with the aircraft overhead. And for 2 hours, George used every ounce of strength he had to swim as far as he possibly could away from this island. But at some point, he was just so unbelievably exhausted, he just could not paddle any farther. And so he's just laying on this raft, when he hears the sound of something coming out of the water, and he turns and he sees the periscope of an American submarine coming out of the water. And seconds later, the crew of this American submarine comes right up alongside him. They grab him out of the raft, they put him in the submarine, and he was saved. Besides George, Ted, and Dell, there were 8 other American airmen that had to bail out of their aircraft because they were badly damaged following this raid. And so originally, those 8 people were not recovered and they were believed to have drowned at sea. But that actually was not true. The US government figured out fairly quickly what happened to them, but the details of what happened to them were so gruesome, the government decided they did not want to tell anyone. They especially didn't want to tell the parents and loved ones of these 8 airmen because they believed if they heard the true account, that would be too traumatic for them. And so they made the details of these 8 deaths totally top secret. But 60 years later, in 2004, an author named James Bradley discovered transcripts from a post-World War II Japanese war crimes trial held in Guam, where Japanese military leaders confessed to what they did to these 8 captured Americans. This is the true account. Unlike George, these 8 other airmen bailed out almost immediately after they got out over the water. And so that placed them in the water very close to the island. And so before the American aircraft could come in and save the day, like they did with George, these 8 airmen were scooped up by the Japanese and brought back to the island. The Japanese soldiers on this island for the past several months have been getting constantly bombed by American aircraft, inflicting a very high casualty rate. And so these soldiers hated the Americans and they wanted revenge against the Americans. And so suddenly you have these 8 American prisoners on this island with no one to protect them. And so what do you think happens? The Japanese decide they're going to exact their revenge on these 8 men. Within 24 hours of being captured, the 8 men were kind of huddled up in one section of the island when one of them, Marv Mershon, who was 19 from Long Beach, California, was grabbed by a Japanese commander, stood up and moved to the central area within their military camp, and they tied him to a tree, and this commander encouraged all of the other soldiers to beat and kick Marv. And so all day long, soldiers were coming up and just beating the crap out of Marv, and Marv is tied to the tree, he can't do anything. And these 7 other prisoners are forced to just watch because they can't do anything. And so that night, the same commander comes back and he unties Marv from the tree and he tells these 7 other prisoners to stay where they are. And this commander and several other Japanese soldiers, they take Marv and they march him away from the group into the jungle, and they march him over to this freshly dug grave. And standing next to the grave that Marv would have seen is this Japanese soldier carrying a sword. And so Marv is told to walk up to the edge of this grave. They tell him to kneel down in front of this grave, and they let him smoke a final cigarette. And apparently Marv very calmly smoked the cigarette, and when he was done, the man with the sword put a blindfold on Marv and then told Marv to extend his neck. And as soon as he did, he was beheaded. Afterwards, they buried him inside of this grave. That night, one of the high-ranking Japanese generals on the island, a man named Yoshio Tachibana, who was an alcoholic and was notorious for his sadistic tendencies with prisoners, he was sitting around drinking, having a good time, when he decided that his soldiers, they needed to prove they had what he called the fighting spirit. And the only way they could show they had this fighting spirit was by consuming human flesh. And so Tachibana ordered his soldiers to go exhume Marv from his shallow grave, and then Tachibana sent over one of his surgeons and he told him to remove Marv's thigh. So the surgeon goes over, he surgically removes Marv's thigh, he gives it to one of the cooks, and the cooks, they make this huge meal using Marv's thigh, and they serve it to Tachibana and his other high-ranking officers and some soldiers. And apparently, Marv's thigh tasted so good with soy sauce and with sake that Tachibana ordered his soldiers to go back and cut more meat off of Marv, which they did. Within a month of Marv's execution and consumption, Tachibana decided that he wanted to eat more human flesh, and he wanted his soldiers to eat more human flesh because he and a number of the other officers were superstitious that this could make them stronger and it would be good for their stomach and it would be good for their health. And so they decide they're going to kill more of the American American prisoners and eat them. And so they brought the 7 remaining American prisoners out to the rifle range, and once they were all out there, one of the Japanese officers grabbed 25-year-old Floyd Hall from Missouri. They pulled him out of the group and they walked him over to the middle of this range and they tied him to a wooden stake in the ground. And once he was in place, Tachibana, who was there, he ordered the other Japanese soldiers to work on their bayonet work on Floyd Hall. And so one by one, these soldiers would go up and plunge their bayonets into Floyd Hall's chest, into his stomach, until he ultimately died. Once he was dead, Tachibana, who had brought along his surgeons for this very reason, he sent them out to remove Floyd's liver and his gallbladder right in front of the now 6 living prisoners. They're watching this happen right in front of them. And then once his liver and gallbladder have been removed and wrapped in cellophane paper to preserve them, these surgeons walked back and stood on the edge because they knew this was not the last execution of the day. And so the other 6 prisoners are looking around, wondering what's next, and then one of the commanders walks over and he grabs another one of the prisoners. His name was Earl Vaughn. He was 22 years old from Texas, and as soon as he was grabbed, he knew he did not want to face the same fate Floyd did, and so right away he became defiant. He wanted to die more quickly, and so he began yelling Semper Fi at the Japanese, and he kept extending his neck and pointing up at his neck, indicating he wanted a clean and quick death. Behead me. And so the Japanese, they tried to strap him to this wooden post because they wanted the other soldiers to work on their bayonets with him, but it was just too difficult with Earl. He put up such a fight and he kept putting his neck out that finally one of the soldiers did pull him down and he was beheaded. And then again, the surgeons came running out into the field, and in plain sight of the now 5 remaining American captives, they removed Earl's liver and his gallbladder and then wrapped them in cellophane paper to preserve them. And then they took Floyd and Earl's organs and they went back to the cooks to have them prepared. And that night, all the high-ranking officers on the island feasted on Earl and Floyd. Within a few days of Floyd and Earl's murders, the other 5 captives were also executed in a similar fashion, one by one, in front of their comrades. And 2 of those remaining 5 were also consumed. And unfortunately, one of those 2 was not executed beforehand. Instead, they had pieces of their body surgically amputated, and then those pieces would get cooked and eaten. And when they were done eating them, they would just come back and cut off more and more and more until there was nothing left to eat. And at that point, that prisoner was executed. They did this in order to keep their meat fresh. After the war was over, 34 Japanese soldiers, including General Tachibana, were tried for war crimes for their atrocities they committed against these 8 prisoners of war. They were all found guilty and they were all hanged and buried in unmarked graves in Guam. The other men on the island that witnessed these atrocities and didn't do anything about it, or participated but in some sort of secondary way, they were also tried for war crimes, found guilty, and sent to jail, but all of them were released after 8 years. George was 80 years old when he finally learned about the atrocities on Chichijima Island that he so narrowly escaped. He, like everyone else that was learning about this, was horrified and disturbed, but more than anything, George felt a deep sense of guilt for having survived. But what we can all say for sure is that George did not waste his second chance at life. George H.W. Bush would go on to become the 41st President of the United States of America, and his son, also named George Bush, would go on to become the 43rd President of the United States of America. 2 world leaders who would change the course of history forever, who never would have been if George Sr. had bailed out of that plane near Chichijima Island just a few seconds earlier. Think about that. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp